At the very beginning of the 20th century, when mankind had already conquered the highest mountains and the deepest rivers, there was only one truly unexplored territory left, a white spot in the south of the map, the majestic and merciless Antarctica. This is where the British explorer and polar hero Sir Ernest Shackleton decided to go. His goal was ambitious to the point of audacity: to cross Antarctica from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea, to go through the South Pole itself. In 1914, this was an almost impossible task, comparable to a flight to the moon. But there was no fear in Shackleton's eyes. Only determination, inner confidence, and a desire to go down in history. By the time Shackleton began planning the expedition, the race for the South Pole was already over. In 1911, the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen reached the pole first, ahead of the tragically deceased Robert Scott. And yet, despite this, Shackleton did not give up on the idea of going to Antarctica. He saw his mission not as a sporting competition, but as a scientific and geographical task. His dream was to cross Antarctica across the entire continent for the first time, revealing its secrets to the world and studying its landscapes, climate, and geology. Preparations for the expedition began in 1913. Shackleton looked for sponsors, convinced the scientific community and the government of the importance of the plan. To implement the plan, he ordered the construction of a special ship capable of withstanding the pressure of Antarctic ice. The vessel received a symbolic name: Endurance. The name was not chosen by chance. The Shackleton family motto was, "By endurance we conquer." The ship was custom-built in Norway, with a reinforced hull made of oak and green pine, specially adapted to polar conditions. It was one of the strongest ships of its time, but even this was not enough. The team was selected with special care. From more than 5,000 applications, Shackleton selected only 28 people. Among them were sailors, scientists, doctors, photographers, and simply brave people willing to risk their lives for a great goal. Shackleton was guided not only by professional skills, but also by personal qualities. He was looking for those who could keep their cool in critical situations, who knew how to be part of a team, even in the harshest conditions. The official name of the expedition was the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. Its plan included 2 ships. The first, the Endurance, was to deliver the main group, led by Shackleton, to the shores of the Weddell Sea, from where the foot crossing of Antarctica would begin. The second ship, the Aurora, was to approach from the opposite side, to the Ross Sea, and land a support team there, which would place food and fuel depots along the route of the main group in advance. Everything was thought out to the smallest detail, at least on paper. But Antarctica, as it soon became clear, does not recognize either plans or logic that on August 1st, 1914, the Endurance left London. A few days before, World War I broke out in Europe. Shackleton was ready to cancel the expedition, but the British Admiralty expressed support. The government considered it important to preserve the spirit of national geographical achievements even in the midst of a crisis. However, the war still affected the expedition. There were difficulties with equipment, financing, and logistics. Nevertheless, in October, the Endurance arrived in Buenos Aires and then headed to South Georgia, the last point of civilization before plunging into the white void. The team was delayed for a month at South Georgia. Local whalers warned Shackleton. The ice in the Weddell Sea was especially dense that year. Navigation might be impossible. But the explorer ignored the warning. He believed that lost time would harm the entire mission and did not want to wait until the next season. On December 5, 1914, the Endurance left South Georgia and set course for Antarctica. The first weeks went smoothly. The ship moved confidently among the ice. The team kept diaries, took photographs, and conducted meteorological observations. Everything looked as if the expedition had really come closer to its great goal. However, already in January 1915, the ice became significantly denser. By January 18th, the Endurance was trapped. Thick ice fields closed around the ship and began to slowly but inexorably squeeze its hull. Shackleton knew that now it could all be over before it had even begun. But he didn't show it. He continued to act calmly, confidently, even inspiringly. He began to reorganize the expedition into survival mode. The crew realized that their task now was not to conquer the continent, but to stay alive. The Endurance was stuck in the ice for almost 10 months. People lived on board, surrounded by frozen silence and polar night, not knowing whether they would be able to get out. Meanwhile, the pressure of the ice was increasing. The hull was cracking, deforming, and starting to leak water. The crew tried to pump it out, but on October 27, 1915, it became clear that the ship was doomed. Shackleton gave the order to abandon ship. People went out onto the ice, taking supplies, tents, and lifeboats. The Endurance continued to slowly disintegrate until it went under the ice on November 21st. Before the ship disappeared, expedition photographer Frank Hurley took the last pictures that later became symbols of this tragic epic. The people were left alone, in the middle of an endless icy hell, hundreds of kilometers from land, without communication with the outside world. Their survival now depended only on themselves. But Shackleton did not lose faith. He understood that as a leader, he was obliged to do more than just lead. He had to instill hope in his people, even when everything seemed lost. And it was this faith that would become the driving force in their incredible struggle for salvation, which was only just beginning. When the ship, Endurance, went under the ice, leaving the crew in the silent expanses of Antarctica, the most difficult and heroic part of the expedition began. This was no longer a scientific mission or a geographical discovery. It was survival. Shackleton understood. He had 27 people, food for several months, minimal equipment, and an icy desert to the horizon. There was no connection with the outside world, no help. All decisions were now on him alone. The people set up a temporary camp on the ice, next to the place where the Endurance was moored. They called it Ocean Camp. The frost was fierce, up to -40°C, but this was not the worst thing. The main thing was that the ice field on which their tent stood was slowly drifting north. They could not control this movement. They were passengers on an uncontrollable slab, surrounded by silence and death. And yet Shackleton did not allow panic to take over. Every day he gave out tasks. Someone chopped ice, someone went after seals and penguins, someone kept watch. He knew, order is life. Discipline is a shield against madness. Several weeks passed. Food supplies were dwindling, the temperature did not rise, and the ice began to crack. The camp had to be moved. The new one was called Patience Camp. The name is symbolic. They had no other weapons than patience and faith. They spent almost 2 months in this camp, living on seal meat, penguins, and melted ice. Shackleton checked the ice every day, listened to its grinding, determined the direction of the drift. He was looking for a chance, the slightest opportunity to get out. And when the ice began to break under his feet, he knew the moment had come. They had 3 lifeboats with them, taken from the Endurance. Each was given a name: James Caird, Stancomb Wills, and Dudley Docker. On April 9, 1916, they launched them. An exhausting, deadly voyage began among icebergs and ice. These boats were not suitable for the open sea. They were small, leaky, constantly filling with icy water. People sat in them, wet, exhausted, in constant danger of capsizing or crashing into an ice block. Just one night in the open ocean cost them days of life. And yet, after 5 days of hell, on April 15, 1916, they reached Elephant Island, a piece of land in the Southern Ocean. It was the first time they had set foot on dry land since leaving South Georgia. People were crying. Some were literally kissing the rocks on the shore. They were alive. But the danger was not over. Elephant Island was uninhabited, rocky, and devoid of vegetation. There was no way to escape. Shackleton knew that if he did not act, they would die here, just as they might have died in the ice. That he made a decision on which everyone's lives depended. He would take one of the boats, the James Caird, and with 5 of his best sailors, head south to South Georgia. It was more than 1,300 kilometers across a raging ocean. No navigation, no radio, just a compass, the stars, and faith. Before setting out, he chose a crew: Frank Worsley, the captain, and an experienced navigator; Tom Crean, a veteran of Antarctic expeditions; Timothy McCarthy, John Vincent, and Harry McNish, a carpenter who rebuilt the boat, strengthening its sides. McNish accomplished the almost impossible. Using scraps, pieces of canvas, wood, and sealskins, he transformed the James Caird into a kind of hermetic rescue capsule. He raised the sides, reinforced the bottom, insulated the seams, and installed a primitive sail. And on April 24, 1916, to the howling wind and the cries of seagulls, 6 men set out into the ocean. The rest remained on Elephant Island, hungry, wet, and buffeted by Antarctic hurricanes. They watched the boat disappear, not knowing if they would see it again. The voyage on the James Caird is one of the most heroic episodes in the history of navigation. Waves up to 15 meters high, icy sails, storms, hunger, thirst. Every day was a struggle with madness. Navigation was conducted by the stars, but the sky was almost always covered with clouds. Worsley took measurements when he could and hoped that they were at least heading in the right direction. They warmed themselves, huddled together, drank melted ice, ate dry rations, and prayed that the boat would not capsize. On May 7, 1916, on the 14th day of the journey, they saw the shores of South Georgia. But this was only half the victory. They approached from the southern side, opposite the whaling station. There was no direct route. The coast was rocky, and the boat was at its limit of strength. Then Shackleton decided on a last desperate step. He, Worsley, and Crean would cross the island on foot, through mountains, glaciers, and gorges, without a map, without equipment, without tents and food. This part of the journey became one of the most mysterious and inspiring. In 36 hours they crossed the island, walked without sleep, crawled along icy slopes, descended along rocks, got stuck in the snow. They miraculously managed not to fall into the abyss. They heard the roar of waterfalls, saw petrels flying past. And finally, in the morning fog, on May 20th, 1916, they heard the whistle of the whaling station of Stromness. It was a moment of triumph. They went down to the people, bearded, emaciated, in rags. One of the Norwegian whalers would later say, "We thought they were ghosts." The whalers immediately provided assistance. They were warmed up, fed, their wounds were bandaged. But Shackleton did not rest. He began to plan the rescue of those remaining on Elephant Island. There were attempts one after another. On the steamship Southern Sky, on the Argentine ship Instituto de Pesca, on the Chilean Emma. Each time the ice did not allow him to get closer. But he did not give up. He understood. Every day of delay was a chance to lose one of his people. He swore to himself, no one would die. And finally, on August 30th, 1916, after 4 months of waiting, on board the Chilean tug Yelcho, Shackleton reached Elephant Island. The people left on the island were exhausted, many were sick, but everyone was alive. When Shackleton stepped ashore, the first thing he asked was, "Is everyone okay?" And when he heard, "Yes, everyone is alive," he just lowered his head. He kept his promise. He led his team out of hell. Not a single person died. This story has become a legend. It is not about heroism as such. It is about duty, faith, resilience, leadership. About how, in the heart of an icy wilderness, a man not only survived, he won. But this victory had a high emotional and physical cost, and it will be revealed in the final chapters of this great odyssey. When the Chilean tugboat Yelcho, commanded by Captain Luis Pardo, brought Shackleton and his crew back to civilization, the story of the rescue of 28 people seemed almost unbelievable. Newspapers around the world began to talk about the feat of the British explorer, comparing him to ancient heroes. But despite the general euphoria, Shackleton himself remained taciturn. He did not seek glory. He knew that he had not survived alone, but together with people who believed in him to the end. It was a victory for the team, not for one person. Returning to Britain, he faced a different world. Europe was plunged into the First World War. The greatness of scientific discoveries and feats seemed dim against the backdrop of mass loss, destruction, and fear. His expedition, which could have been a triumph of science, turned into a restrained chronicle of survival. However, even in these conditions, the story of endurance remained an inspiring example of the strength of the human spirit. It was especially significant for those who fought in the trenches. They saw in it an example of unbending will and hope for a return. Shackleton did not stay away from the war. Despite physical exhaustion and age, he joined the British Army. In 1917, he was sent to Murmansk as part of the Expeditionary Corps, where he was engaged in logistics and supplies. This work was far from the romance of Antarctica, but he accepted it as a duty. After the war, he returned to the main passion of his life, the poles. He was again drawn to the icy expanses, as if something inside did not allow him to remain. In comfort, he began to prepare a new expedition. Despite financial difficulties, deteriorating health, and political changes in the world in 1921, he announced the start of the Shackleton Queer Expedition. The purpose of this voyage was to explore the islands of the South Atlantic, the coast of Antarctica, and, perhaps, to reach areas previously inaccessible. He was again accompanied by some of the members of the Endurance expedition, including the faithful Captain Frank Worsley. This time the vessel was a ship called the Quest, a small but strong one. Although organizing the expedition was much more difficult than before, Shackleton showed the same persistence as before. He set off again for South Georgia, the very point on the map where his fight for survival had once begun, but fate had already begun to write the last chapter of his life. On January 5, 1922, while on board the Quest, moored at South Georgia, Shackleton suddenly felt ill. The doctor diagnosed a heart attack. Shortly after, Shackleton died. He was 47 years old. His death shocked everyone who knew him personally and who followed his exploits. He died in the place where he had once made his greatest rescue. As if Antarctica had finally called him back, at the request of his wife and at the insistence of his crew, Shackleton was buried on South Georgia in Grytviken Bay. His grave is still a place of pilgrimage for polar explorers, researchers, and those who seek inspiration in the story of courage and loyalty. The line on the tombstone reads, Shackleton, explorer, 1874 to 1922 inch. A modest inscription for a great man, but Shackleton's story did not end with his death. It continued to live on in the diaries, memoirs, and recollections of his comrades. Particularly important was the diary of Frank Wild, Shackleton's deputy, who remained with the main group on Elephant Island and maintained morale while the search for rescue was underway. It was he who continued Shackleton's work after his death, trying to bring the expedition he had started to the end. But no one could replace Shackleton as a leader. He was unique, as a person, as a commander, and as a symbol. In the following decades, the history of the Endurance acquired new details. Archives were published, Frank Hurley's photographs were published in albums, memoirs became bestsellers. But there were also periods of oblivion, especially in the middle of the 20th century, when humanity's attention switched to space and technology. Only by the end of the century did interest in Shackleton's feat flare up with renewed vigor. His leadership style was studied in business schools. His principles, endurance, honesty, caring for people, became an example for managers and politicians. He became the hero of books, films, and documentary series. His story inspired expeditions of the 21st century, setting off to Antarctica in his footsteps. The 2019 expedition, which set out to find the sunken Endurance, generated a particular wave of interest. Many considered it impossible. The ship had lain for over 100 years at the bottom of the Weddell Sea, in an area with extreme conditions, ice, and depths of over 3,000 meters. But thanks to modern underwater drones and navigation technology, it was possible to get closer to the supposed wreck site. And in March 2022, exactly 100 years after Shackleton's death, the world received sensational news. The ship had been found. Filming showed that the ship was virtually undamaged. The hull, the deck, even the name on the stern, everything was perfectly preserved. The ice that destroyed the ship also became its guardian. The absence of light, microbes, and tree parasites allowed the Endurance to remain as if frozen in time. This discovery was not just an archaeological triumph. It became a symbol. The memory of the feat has not disappeared. She was lying in the depths of the ocean, but she survived, just like the people on that expedition. This discovery brought Shackleton back to the attention of a new audience. The younger generation, who grew up in a digital world, suddenly saw him not just as a character from old chronicles, but as a real hero. He was not perfect. He did not conquer the South Pole. He failed as an explorer, but he won where it mattered most. He saved his people, did not betray a single one, did not give up under any circumstances. The story of Endurance is not just an Antarctic saga. It is a mirror of human nature in extreme conditions. It is an example of how a person can maintain dignity, rationality, and care for others, even when everything around him is collapsing.